The war in Ukraine is one of the most discussed conflicts in the world, but a lot of the discussion is shaped by perspectives that are far removed from the reality many Europeans experience. In many American debates, this war is often framed as a conflict between Russia and the United States, NATO, or the broader West. It is discussed through the lens of an American foreign policy, great power competition, and concerns about escalation. But for many Europeans, especially those living closer to Russia's borders, the perspective is different. This is not primarily viewed as a proxy war between superpowers. It is viewed as a war where one European country invaded another European country and attempted to change its borders through military force. Many Europeans look at this conflict through their own history. Countries in Eastern and Northern Europe remember Soviet domination, forced political alignment, and the loss of sovereignty during the 20th century. For these countries, concerns about Russia are not based only on what Russia says today, but also on what Russia has done historically. This is why many Europeans do not see NATO expansion as the simple cause of this conflict. Many see NATO membership as a consequence of countries seeking protection after decades of insecurity. This is also where I believe some commentators, including people like Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks and Hassan Piker, often, often get the analysis wrong. The problem is not that they criticize NATO, the United States, or Western foreign policy. Those criticisms can be legitimate and deserve discussion. The problem is that some of their arguments often focus heavily on Western actions while giving less attention to the decisions Russia made that created the current situation. They often frame Russia's invasion as a reaction to NATO expansion, Western pressure, or American involvement, while minimizing the fact that Ukraine is an independent country with its own population, its own government, and its own right to choose its alliances. A country's security concerns can be real, but they do not automatically give that country the right to invade another nation or decide what choices its neighbors are allowed to make. The European perspective is that security cannot be built by allowing larger countries to control the foreign policy decisions of smaller countries through threats or military force. That does not mean Europe has made no mistakes. It does not mean every NATO decision was perfect. It does not mean diplomacy should never be attempted. But it does mean that any serious discussion about this war has to start with the reality that Russia chose to launch a full scale invasion of Ukraine and that Ukraine chose to defend itself. In this series, I want to go through the arguments being made about the war, look at the missing context, and explain why many Europeans view these discussions very differently from some commentators in the United States.
Interesting. So you mentioned that there hasn't been any major, military operations over the last few months. Like where is this headed? I mean, is this a quagmire or is there any any movement on the Russian side to maybe put an end to this?
Yeah, there has been, and it hasn't gotten any media coverage at all here. And I've been really surprised at because a lot of the stuff is open on the Russian side. I talked a minute ago about in the Iran where you got to listen to the Iranian side and the American side and the Israeli side to try to figure out what's actually going on. Same thing here. You got to listen to the Ukrainian side, but you also have to listen to the Russian side. And the Russians are furious at Putin, and they have been growing up for a number of months now because he hasn't been pushing hard enough. Because when this came to the, we crossed over the 4-year mark here not too long ago in February, and that eventually exceeded the period that the Russians were in World War II, and a lot of them were going, "Hey, hang on a minute." Our greatest generation won our war in whatever the total number of days was, 1,300, something like that. And they said, now then here we are, we've passed that against one country, not against the whole Nazi empire. Why can we not win this? And why aren't you trying harder? And Putin is very risk averse, so he hasn't been wanting to push hard. But now that he's starting to take pressure, even at the troop level, I've gotten some sources who have direct connection to people at the front line. and then others at the strategic level, and they're all getting angry at Putin, and it's starting to become public. So that's putting pressure on him to do something different and to take more of a risk. And now then there's a guy named Karaganov, who came out along with a couple of others, has been saying, you know what? It's time to change the dynamics here. We have been, it's just Russia against Ukraine on the ground, but it's Russia against 50 nations from the United States and all the European nations and a bunch of others from Asia, et cetera. And they say, we're tired of this. It's not just one-on-one, it's one on 50. And it's time for us to change the dynamic and start firing missiles into European cities, into European military facilities that are
Wow.
supporting us against this. And they said if that doesn't deter them from stopping any further, then we need to escalate to tactical nuclear weapons. They're saying this out loud, and it's not getting any kind of coverage. I had John Mearsheimer on my show this afternoon, and we talked about this extensively and showed some of the video from it. There's been another one since that time I found on Russian media, and they are getting very serious about this. And I'm
The
just really
first major
alarmed that
point I
we
want
haven't
to
been paying
address is
any
the
attention.
claim that Russia is not really fighting Ukraine, but instead is fighting the entire Western world. In the interview, the argument is made that Russia is effectively fighting 50 nations because the United States, European countries, and other allies are supporting Ukraine. There is an element of truth here. Ukraine has received significant military, financial, and political support from many countries. However, the way this is framed changes the context. Russia is not fighting 50 countries that invaded Russia. NATO soldiers are not fighting Russian forces on Ukrainian territory. Western countries did not launch a military campaign against Russia. The reason these countries became involved is because Russia launched a full scale invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine requested support to defend itself. The difference between these two narratives is important. One narrative says Russia is fighting a Western coalition that is attacking it. The other says Russia invaded Ukraine and Ukraine received international support afterward. Those two, those two descriptions lead to very different conclusions. The interview then argues that Russia is becoming increasingly frustrated because it believes it is not fighting hard enough against the West. The argument is that Russia sees this as an unfair conflict because it is not only Ukraine, but Ukraine backed by many other countries. But this again removes an important part of the timeline. The involvement of the Western countries did not happen before the war. It increased after Russia invaded. Many European countries do not see their support for Ukraine as an attack on Russia. They see it as support for a country that was invaded. From the European perspective, the question is not why is Europe opposing Russia? The question is why did Russia create such a situation where its neighbors felt the need to increase their security? The discussion then moves into Russian frustration and comments from figures like Sergei Karaganov, who have argued for strikes against European targets and even the use of nuclear weapons. First, it is important to acknowledge that the risk of nuclear escalation is real. Any conflict involving nuclear powers carries serious consequences, and the possibility of escalation should always be taken seriously. However, the argument being presented creates a connection that is not automatically true. The argument is essentially Russia feels threatened, Russia may escalate, therefore, Western actions are causing Russian escalation. But this skips an important part Russia's own choices. Figures like Sergei Karaganov are openly arguing for a more aggressive approach, including using nuclear threats as a way to force Western countries to change their behavior. These views are important to discuss, but they should not be presented as if Russia has no agency or is simply being pushed into escalation. Throughout this war, Russian officials and state media have repeatedly used nuclear rhetoric. These threats have appeared in response to Western weapons deliveries, military support for Ukraine, discussions about NATO, and battlefield developments. This does not mean Russia will automatically use nuclear weapons. Nuclear powers often use nuclear signaling as a tool to intimidate opponents, discourage support for their enemies, and influence political decisions. But it does show an important pattern. Nuclear threats have been part of Russia's strategy throughout the war, not simply as a not simply a reaction to recent European decisions. A country can feel threatened, angry, or insecure, but those feelings do not remove responsibility for the choices it makes. If Russia decides to escalate the conflict or use nuclear weapons, that would be a decision made by the Russian leadership. Security concerns can help explain why a country acts a certain way, but they do not automatically justify those actions or transfer responsibility to the countries responding to them. The European perspective is that allowing nuclear threats to dictate foreign policy creates a dangerous precedent. It would mean that any nuclear armed country could use the threat of escalation to prevent other nations from supporting a country under attack. The interviewer also argues that Russia is becoming stronger because it has increased weapons production, while Western countries have weakened their own militaries by supporting Ukraine. There is some truth to the fact that Russia has shifted its economy towards wartime production. Russia has increased defense spending and expanded production of ammunition, drones, and military equipment. However, military production alone does not determine whether a country has achieved its strategic goals. The important question is, what were Russia's goals when it started the war? In 2022, Russia launched a major offensive that appeared aimed at quickly taking Kiev, weakening the Ukrainian government, and forcing Ukraine into submission. That did not happen. Instead, the war turned into a long attritional conflict. A country can produce large amounts of weapons and still fail to achieve the political objectives that started the war. It is also important to recognize that Russia is not the only country that has adapted. European countries have also significantly increased their defense spending and are expanding their military production capacity in response to Russia's actions. For many European countries, this is not preparation for an offensive war against Russia. It is a response to a realization that a major conventional war is possible on the European continent and that relying on limited stockpiles is no longer sufficient. Countries are increasing production of ammunition, air defense systems, and other military capabilities because Russia has demonstrated the ability to sustain a large scale war. So the picture is not simply Russia is preparing while the West is becoming weaker. A more accurate picture is Russia shifted its economy toward wartime production, and European countries are now doing the same in response to the changed security environment. The key difference is the reason behind these actions. Russia increased production to support its war in Ukraine. European countries are increasing production because they believe they need to deter further aggression and rebuild their own defense capabilities. The interviewer also argues that Europe is preparing for war with Russia and that this is causing Russia to respond. But again, the timeline matters. European defense spending increased after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and Russia launched the full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Many European countries do not believe they are preparing for war because they want conflict with Russia. They believe they are preparing because Russia has demonstrated that it is willing to use military force to change borders. The European perspective is therefore different from the one presented in this interview. Many Europeans do not see this as Russia versus NATO. They see it as Ukraine, a European country, being invaded by a larger neighboring country, and other countries deciding whether to help it to defend itself. That does not mean Europe has made no mistakes. It does not mean every NATO decision was perfect. It does not mean diplomacy should be ignored. But it does mean that any serious discussion has to include the choices Russia made and the responsibility Russia has for starting this war.
So I have a friend named Greg who he's been just nudging me to cover this. And I have to be honest with you, part of me felt like maybe he's being a little bit hysterical because he really believes that pretty soon Europe is going to engage in a kinetic war with Russia, and it could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And he's like, Anna, you got to dig deeper. You got to dig deeper. But based on what you're telling me, there's a likelihood that that could happen, but Russia uh, would be the one taking the first, carrying out the first strikes.
What the Russians are saying in this Karaganov is his name, has been saying this for literally a long time. He was an early proponent of this, but he was a kind of a fringe guy. But now that because it's dragged on so long, it's moved into the mainstream, and a lot of people are saying, yeah, we think this is going to be the case. It's been fed by, I mean, really all the way through, and it's continued on from the European leaders very foolishly continuing to threaten Russia. And they have moved German troops into the Baltics, for example. They keep talking over and over about we have to have this rebuild Europe, and we have to have this $800 billion advancement, and we have to get ready to fight Russia by 2030 or 2029 even. So they're all trying to grow their forces. They're saying, let's all add 5% of GDP. Let's go up to a wartime footing. So the Russians are hearing all that, and they're thinking, well, we're not just going to be sitting on our hands and doing nothing, especially when we're just nibbling at the front lines here. So that's why they're saying we got to do something different. And so they're saying instead of all these 50 countries supporting the killing of Russian troops on our front lines, how about we take the fight to them for the first time? Because they say we're already effectively at war. How about we make them pay some of the price too, and not just our side? And that's the danger, that we keep talking on the Western side about all this coming war with Russia, and now then they're starting to believe it, and now then they may be ready to take some action on it. Now it all goes down to President Putin. How much risk is he willing to take, and how much pressure can he resist on the inside? Because they may strike military targets in Europe, and of course that's an Article 5 trigger right there that's going to definitely trigger that. But how much appetite is there going to be from our weakened military, Anna? Because we have spent 4 years emptying out our arsenals to give them to Ukraine to go and try to kill Russians. But now we don't have the industrial capacity to replace that. So we're now in a very weakened position, while Russia is the opposite. They are now busting at the seams with all kinds of missiles and drones, artillery shells, everything you need to fight a modern war. They have been stockpiling this stuff while they're fighting here. We can't fight a conventional war, or God forbid, a nuclear strike. We just can't do it, or it could be destroying of everybody. But Russia is feeling like they're in the increasing powerful position because they've been preparing for it and mentally, whereas all we do is talk a lot of stuff and then deplete our arsenal. So it's a bad situation.
At this point in the interview, Anna brings up a friend named Greg who warned her that Europe could eventually end up in a direct war with Russia. She admits she initially thought he was being a little hysterical, but after hearing Daniel Davis, she starts treating that scenario as increasingly likely. This is where I think the conversation starts to go off track. The evidence presented is not that Russia is preparing to attack Europe. The evidence is that some Russian commentators and strategists are talking about escalation. Those are not the same thing. Every major country has military analysts, politicians, and commentators who advocate extreme policies. If we treated every statement from a think tank, retired officer, or political commentator as official government policy, then every country on earth would appear to be on the verge of war. What is missing from this discussion is a simple question. What is Russia actually capable of doing? Russia has spent years fighting in Ukraine. It failed to take Kiev. It has suffered significant losses in men and equipment. If the war has proven anything, it is that modern warfare is far more difficult than many expected in 2022. There is also another major reason Europe is rearming that Daniel Davis completely leaves out. For decades, European countries relied heavily on the United States for their security. More recently, Donald Trump repeatedly questioned America's commitment to NATO, threatened to reduce support for European allies, and pressured European governments to take greater responsibility for their own defense. From a European perspective, rearmament is not only a response to Russia, it also a response to uncertainty about whether the United States will remain a reliable security partner in the future. If Washington is signaling that Europe may need to defend itself, then increasing defense spending is not evidence that Europe wants war with Russia. It is evidence that Europe is preparing for a world where it may have to stand on its own. Daniel Davis presents European rearmament as proof that Europe is preparing for conflict with Russia. Many Europeans see it differently. They see it as a reaction to two realities at the same time: a more aggressive Russia and a less predictable United States. So before jumping to the conclusion that Europe is preparing for war, it is worth considering that European perspective. Europe is not rearming because it wants a conflict with Russia. Europe is rearming because Russia invaded Ukraine and because the United States has repeatedly signaled that Europe should be prepared to take more responsibility for its own security. That is deterrence, not preparation for an invasion.
The underlying disagreement, the big debate, is what the intentions of Vladimir Putin is, what the Russians want to accomplish, right? So, if you speak to anyone in the Western world, they are absolutely convinced that the whole point of all of this is to rebuild Soviet Russia, not in terms of communism, but in terms of the land grabs
Empire.
and
Yeah.
the expansion, the empire. Yeah. So that's what the Europeans believe. That's what the United States believes. Russia, on the other hand, has consistently made the argument that the reason why this happened is because of the security risk or threat to Russia imposed by NATO. What is the truth? What is the reality?
Yeah, this stuff that they're trying to rebuild the Soviet Union and trying to get ready to advance on the ground towards the West is complete fiction that we created.
Mhm.
This goes back to 2007. 2007 at the Munich Security Conference when Putin was first invited for the first time because they were trying to, this was in the euphoria, the short-lived euphoria after the end of the Cold War, and we said, hey, let's have a European-wide security architecture. And so Putin was invited to Munich to have a conversation, and he said, listen, about this NATO expansion. And he said something which, and I've written on this extensively before the war started. I said, listen, what sense does it make for, I think it was 16 members of NATO to stand against the totality of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries in like 50,000 tanks, and I forget how many tens of thousands of missiles and planes and all that. And we stood up against them and we stared them down during the Cold War, and then they ended up falling. Now, what sense does it make once they disintegrate that we need to expand that NATO? If 16 stopped all of that and now that they've disintegrated, you don't even need it anymore, much less
Mhm.
to expand it. But it's like we took advantage of that, and it wasn't collective security anymore. It was advancement and to keep Russia down. And then it kept going on and on. And so in 2007, Putin said, hey, who is this expansion directed against? Because you say it's not us, but there's nobody else out there. It's only us. And if you
Right.
keep going, there's going to be a problem. In 2008, then NATO took a step and says, as a matter of fact, it's not just the Baltic countries and these others. We're going to expand into Georgia and to Ukraine. And Russia says, no, you're not, because it's one thing for the Baltics, which we don't like, but that's militarily defensible for us. There's a lot of reasons why that's not that hard of a task to defend. But Ukraine, that's like right down the plains that has a path leading straight to Moscow that twice Western powers, Napoleon and then Hitler, used to invade Russia in the past. And so they say, no, that's not happening. If you do that, and this was eventually told to Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO Secretary General, if you put NATO into Ukraine, there will be war. But if you just take that off the table, there won't be any war. And Jens Stoltenberg mocked it and said, nobody tells us what to do. They will come in. And then Putin said, then you're going to have war, because there's no way in God's earth we're going to let your military alliance come up to our border like it's happened twice in the previous 2 centuries, like we would do, Anna. There's no way
Mhm.
on God's earth we would ever allow China or Russia to move into a military alliance with Canada or with Mexico or Cuba, for example. We would never allow any of that. Or
I mean,
Venezuela.
At this point in the interview, Anna asks one of the most important questions. Why is Vladimir Putin doing this? What is Russia actually trying to achieve? And this is where Daniel Davis presents a very common argument that NATO expansion is the primary reason Russia invaded Ukraine. But this explanation gets the cause and effect backwards. Davis presents NATO expansion as something that happened to Russia, but he ignores why that expansion happened in the first place. countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and other Eastern European nations did not join NATO because the West wanted to surround Russia. They joined because they had experienced decades of Soviet domination and wanted security guarantees against a possible return of Russian influence. The argument assumes that NATO moving closer to Russia created fear, but from the perspective of many Eastern European countries, Russia's actions created the fear that drove them towards NATO. This is the missing part of the argument. NATO did not expand into Eastern Europe by force. Independent countries chose to join because they believed membership made them safer. So the question is not only why did NATO move closer to Russia? The more important question is why did Russia's neighbors feel safer inside NATO than outside of it? There is also another problem with Colonel Davis' argument. Timeline. He presents 2007 when Putin gave his Munich Security Conference speech criticizing NATO expansion as the moment this conflict started. But that is not where the story begins. NATO expansion was already underway years before that. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999. And in 2004, NATO expanded further with countries including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Bulgaria. So by 2007, the process Davis describes as the cause had already happened. The question then becomes why did these countries want to join NATO in the first place? They were not trying to threaten Russia. They were trying to protect themselves from a history they remembered very clearly. The mistake in this argument is treating NATO expansion as the original event that created insecurity, while ignoring that Russia's neighbors had their own security concerns based on decades of Soviet control and later Russian behavior. The timeline matters because it changes the question. It is not simply why did NATO move east, it is also why did so many countries in Eastern Europe believe moving closer to NATO was necessary for their own security?
Instead of allowing that to happen, we supported the crowd running the Yanukovych out, and then they just took power. And of course, you may be familiar with the what's her face, Victoria Nuland, with that famous intercepted phone where we're deciding who's going to be the next leader of Ukraine, and we're talking about all these different people. We put our handpicked person in there because we didn't want there to be an election. We just wanted to choose who was in charge. In response, Putin said, okay, then I see how this is going. We agreed to elections. We aren't going to agree to a coup, and we're now going to take Crimea, which is 95% ethnic Russian anyway. So it was in reaction to what we had helped facilitate inside of Ukraine. That's where that came from.
I could talk to you about this for the rest of the show, but unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up soon. But I have.
In the final part of the interview, Colonel Davis points to the 2014 Odessa fire as evidence that Russia had to intervene to protect ethnic Russians. The Odessa fire was a horrific tragedy, and the deaths of those people should never be minimized. But acknowledging that that tragedy does not automatically validate Russia's broader narrative. What happened in Odessa was the result of violent clashes between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian groups that spiraled out of control. It was not evidence that the Ukrainian state was carrying out a campaign of extermination against ethnic Russians. This distinction matters because Russia has repeatedly used isolated events and real grievances to support a much larger claim that Russian-speaking Ukrainians needed military intervention from Moscow. If that were true, we would have expected Russian-speaking Ukrainians to overwhelmingly welcome Russian forces in 2022. Instead, many of the fiercest resistance to the invasion came from predominantly Russian-speaking cities such as Kharkiv, Odessa, and Zaporizhia. The tragedy in Odessa was real, but using it to justify the invasion of an entire country is a leap that Colonel Davis never actually proves. My issue with this interview is not that Colonel Davis raises difficult facts, it's that he presents them as if they lead to the only one conclusion. Yes, NATO expansion happened. Yes, Ukraine had internal problems. Yes, tragedies like Odessa happened. But none of that changes the fact that Russia made the decision to invade a sovereign country. What is also missing from this discussion is that Ukraine is not the same country it was in 2022. With major support from the European nations, Ukraine has built up its own defense industry, expanded drone production, and developed the ability to continue resisting the Russian assault. The idea that Ukraine's future is decided only in Washington is outdated. The US remains important, but Europe and Ukraine themselves now have far more influence over the direction of this war. From a European perspective, this war is not about controlling Ukraine, it is about allowing Ukraine to decide its own future.